First of all, Chairman, it's a great pleasure for me to be invited to be here in Glentees and to speak to the MacGill Summer School. I do think it's very appropriate that we're looking at this topic because, of course, the origins of a lot of suffering in relation to unemployment, in relation to hiring fares, in relation to some of the references that Blair made to 19th century attitudes to poor law. People who lived in this area and who emigrated from this area to Scotland and other places, including Patrick MacGill himself, really suffered and experienced what those attitudes were like when carried into actual policy implementation. And I know at previous MacGills that I've been here, there's been a whole lot of interesting literature available at the back about life histories of people who experienced those kind of structures in Irish society in the 19th and early 20th century. An interesting item caught my eye in a recent New York Times. Its title was, "As Government Aid Fades, So May the Recovery." The article had a telling point. In the US, an extraordinary amount of personal income comes directly from Uncle Sam's treasury. Close to €2 out of every €10 in American wallets come from jobless payments, social security and disability benefits. Some of these payments are under threat as public spending is trimmed severely. But many US economists have expressed concern that this lost income will cramp consumer spending and act as a brake on recovery. And things aren't much different here. We get very compelling arguments about spending on banks and bankers, but I think it is important to think about the importance of the social welfare spend, not just for people who depend on it for income support, but also for its importance to our economy. On the one hand, there is a continuing gap between the Exchequer's revenue and spending that remains as acute as it was at any time during the past few years. There's no getting away from the necessity to reduce that deficit, both in scale and the percentage of GDP. Welfare spending, which now exceeds €20 billion, is the biggest ticket item in any budget, and it has to take its share of spending adjustments and cuts. On the other hand, there is the undoubted economic impact of such cuts, apart altogether from their social justice and equality impacts. Welfare spending has a very direct stimulus effect in that it feeds very fundamentally and immediately into consumer spending. People who live principally on benefits have little choice but to spend the money rather than to save it. So any reduction in social benefits will take money out of circulation and will have a ripple effect on the wider economy. So welfare spending adjustments and cuts have to be approached with care and caution, with due regard to the economic consequences. If recovery is dependent on domestic demand, then excessive austerity could make a bad situation worse. And as my mathematician husband, Pat, never tires of reminding me, it is a simple mathematical fact that any decline in GDP makes any reduction in this percentage deficit much more problematical. And we've seen the evidence of that over the last few years in this country. I think George Osborne is experiencing it quite acutely in the United Kingdom at the moment. On the other hand, there is the clear, however unpalatable demand of the EU IMF programme, which doesn't leave too much room for debate or argument as long as we are dependent on the Troika for day-to-day funding support. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living through an economic recession, the likes of which we have not witnessed since the 1930s. We have to use this crisis as an opportunity to bring about the reform and transformation of our country that should have taken place in the good times. No individual group or sector can argue that they should not be affected. We must all join together in the common purpose of building a society that enables our people to achieve their full potential. Transformation of our system of social protection is key to preserving our way of life in this country. First, there is the fiscal situation. I don't have to remind such a very well-informed audience that the gap between what we take in taxes and what we spend in the provision of public services is in the region of about 19 billion this year. Of course, part of this deficit is cyclical and will be reduced once the economy recovers and activity increases and people and businesses go back to work. However, there is a significant part that is structural. The structural deficit exists because the state is still largely bound by spending commitments made in the good times, while the sources of tax revenue to fund these commitments have simply disappeared. And of course our credit rating as a state is in suspension because of what's happened in terms of the banking crisis and the construction collapse. The social protection budget grew in a particularly dramatic fashion over the past decade. In 2001, spending on social protection stood at 7.84 billion, just under 8 billion. By last year, this had grown to over 20 billion, an increase of about 266%. Inflation increased by about 30% in the same period. So while some of the expenditure increase is clearly due to the dramatic rise in employment since 2007, the most significant factor is a surge in both rates and the number and size of schemes over a very long period of Fianna Fáil administration and government. Frankly, the increases in social protection payments, they were, some of them, very cynically timed to help that party when it came to election time. As a result, we have inherited a level of social expenditure that is completely out of sync with the funding base of the state. It is clear that we need to put it on a more sustainable footing. Secondly, while our social protection system is successful in providing a basic level of income support and a threshold of decency, it does not sufficiently enable people to get themselves back on track, into work, or in the absence of jobs, to get back to education or training, and ultimately to achieve their full potential and to make themselves financially independent. Our social welfare system has taken, as both Philip and Blair have said, a largely passive approach. We allow people to receive certain benefits, in some cases indefinitely. Traditionally, there were only very limited sanctions for those who refused offers of work or training. Internationally, a number of the cash benefit schemes we provide are outliers. For example, universal child cash benefits, whereas other countries place emphasis on childcare and preschool education. The Troika, whom I've met a couple of times, they are asking very hard questions about the extent to which we can preserve such benefits when they are way in excess of what is provided to their own citizens by the countries that are keeping our state on life support. They're also asking the same about top-level salaries, particularly in the public sector in this country, in the same way. I mean, I think it is something that very senior public servants tend to prepare notes on, compare and contrast when they're in these international meetings. Our system has also had very limited success to date in what is known, and has been mentioned by Blair and Philip, what is known as activation. In other words, assisting people in getting back to work, education or training as soon as possible by providing advice, placement and training referral services. Over the past decade, most OECD countries have successfully introduced such policies, while in Ireland there has been hardly any movement at all in this area. In fact, sometimes during the course of the boom in discussions, I often got the feeling that people who had become long-term unemployed, there was a slight feeling that maybe they couldn't be employed, that they were almost unemployable. More is the pity, for the OECD has estimated that we should have entered the recession with 100,000 people fewer on the live register if Fianna Fáil governments had introduced such policies during the good times. Finally, given the significant increases in rates over the past decade, the so-called replacement rate, or the proportion of their former wages that unemployed people receive in benefits, has increased, and in the case of some recipients to levels where it may discourage them from seeking work, particularly if you consider rent supplement, which, say, a family of 5 might get at the rate of €1,000 a month for a 3-bedroom, 4-bedroomed house in the Dublin area. That's an extra €12,000 a year on top of social welfare benefits. And that's one area where unemployment traps are a difficulty for large families. There's no doubt about that. I've always had a strong belief in the power of self-improvement and development. While responsibility for such personal transformation lies largely with each individual, citizens also need the right kind of support and encouragement from the family, from the community, and ultimately from the state. Many in our society are fortunate enough to be born and raised in circumstances which are favourable to this. However, a significant minority is not. For people who don't inherit wealth, don't even necessarily inherit part or all of a family home, we have to ensure that our education and social protection systems act as a catalyst for self-improvement and for the full achievement of people's potential. We have to focus on people's capabilities. What are people actually able to do and to be? What real opportunities are available to them? Strong systems of social protection are at the heart of the world's most successful and dynamic economies. Countries like Denmark, Sweden, Finland and the Netherlands, some comparable in size to ours, have over time developed systems that enable citizens to cope with the economic risks of modern life. They provide sufficient income to deal with unexpected circumstances like unemployment, illness or disability, or support for particular stages of life, like childhood, the birth of a child, and old age and retirement. These countries view social security as a collective insurance mechanism for redistribution over the life cycle, the so-called piggy bank function of the welfare state. It is a social contract between the state and the citizen, and like all contracts, it imposes duties and obligations on both parties. However, we should not confine our search for effective systems to the Nordics. Some of the most radical and innovative transformations of social protection have taken place in what were once called developing countries, but are now the rising nations of the world, for example, Brazil and Mexico. Conditional cash transfers programmes have been the centrepiece of reform in some of these countries. Brazil and Mexico provide money to poor families on condition that those transfers are used as an investment in their children's development, such as regular school attendance and basic preventative health care. When we compare our current system of social protection to the contributory-based social contract that exists in the Nordic countries and as I said, the highly successful system of conditional payments in parts of Latin America, we see that they require the recipients of state assistance to do something in return, whereas in this country we rarely do. Our system, in such countries, social protection therefore acts as a hand up rather than a hand out. And our system of social protection, in my view, must do the same. The implied social contract in our contributory system is that people contribute during their working lives, and most of us hope to have an active working life of roughly 40 years, maybe even more as life expectancy continues to expand. So people contribute during their working life. In return, the state supports them in retirement, unemployment and in illness. And that is the contract. And I think we have to be conscious that it's a mutual protection and mutual social insurance for all of us. But it does imply not just rights, but obligations and responsibilities as well. The programme for government commits us to maintaining social welfare rates while implementing a radical programme of reform of social protection in order to create a fiscally sustainable system that is targeted, actively engages with people and makes work more attractive than welfare, or as Blair said, that work must pay or work should pay. And by the way, in most of in Ireland, in most cases, work does pay. There are anomalies, as I said, in relation to areas like rent supplement, but in most cases, it does pay to take a job. These reforms build on the very clear commitments in our EU IMF programme, and as you are all aware, that programme commits us to an adjustment of at least 3.6 billion in budget 2012, and that includes expenditure reductions across government spending of 2.1 billion. As one of the largest spending departments, it is clear that social protection will have to make a major contribution to these reductions, a task that is made infinitely more difficult by the ongoing increase in the live register. The reform agenda has already begun. We are in the middle of the comprehensive review of expenditure. In my department, we've set up the advisory group on tax and social welfare. We have begun to refocus on how to crack down on fraud and abuse in the system. And we have launched a new internship scheme called JobBridge. And interestingly, some 1,000 places have been offered by employers to date. Interesting internships in relation to the scheme, which was launched just over a month ago. But the key element of our transformation, and both Philip and Blair talked about this, from a passive system of income support to a more proactive model, is the establishment of this new, and I think it's a difficult title, this new National Employment and Entitlement Service. And this was approved this week by the Cabinet. It has been the subject of very deep consultation between my department and community welfare officers and their representatives and the employment services side of FOS. It's a very exciting development. It's also a hugely challenging development. It involves 1,000 community welfare officers who worked in the HSE joining the Department of Social Protection as civil servants by the 30th of September, and that process is well underway. It involves up to 700 or 800 FOS employees from the old FOS joining again as civil servants into the Department of Social Protection. This is an enormous additional resource directly into an integrated social welfare system, which will move to a one-stop shop or a one area point of provision. The idea is to create an integrated service for people seeking to establish their benefit entitlements, get a supporting payment, people looking for a job, and people seeking advice on their training options and opportunities. The service will engage with people on the live register in a radically different manner. Instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, which is set out in great detail in the SRI study that Philip published in April, the service will use data-driven techniques to basically identify and segment people who are claiming, people who are recipients of benefits, based on their probability of finding a job. So if somebody is the early school leaver whom Philip talked about, who maybe just did their junior cert, didn't maybe even do the leaving, drifted maybe into short-term unemployment, if they come in again to register for unemployment, it's obvious that in the current labour market, most people might suggest that their chances of getting good long-term employment are probably fairly limited. Maybe they should be persuaded to think about going back to education and upskilling for when the recession comes to an end. This system is currently being piloted in Dunleary and it's due to be rolled out in a number of different areas over the autumn. I want to turn, though, now to a more fundamental question as to how the present welfare state succeeds in its primary anti-poverty mission. I'm not at all convinced that many of the existing programmes are quite as fit for purpose as is generally assumed. Nowhere is this more evident than in the outcomes that concern children. I share the view that the emphasis ought to shift away from the provision of direct cash supports for children towards services that genuinely enhance life chances. The fact that Ireland has comparatively generous child benefit rates in no way guarantees that our children fare better when they come towards adulthood. The many billions that have been transferred to families through a variety of cash supports over the years have not remotely succeeded in meeting their anticipated poverty reduction targets. They have helped, but they have not succeeded in actually eliminating child poverty. Poor children tend to become poor adults. There are exceptions, of course, many exceptions, but the general trend of outcomes points to that inconvenient truth and the necessity to look again at how we spend social welfare money. There is compelling international evidence that by the age of 3, before primary education starts, that the life chances of many children are already firmly established. Disadvantage then tends to remain firmly rooted, and there is little sign that schools close the attainment gaps, with children who arrive in the bottom range of ability tending to stay there through all the years of public education. Accordingly, I take the view that resources ought to be ploughed into early childhood services, including support for parenting skills. In my view, foundation years ought to rank equal to primary and second education. This is a tall order at any time, and it's particularly difficult just at this moment of national crisis. But I take encouragement from the historical fact that the greatest social advances in the 20th century came from policies developed by Beveridge and his team during the Second World War years. And when Roosevelt and Churchill met when America was about to go into the Second World War, the dividend they wanted out of the horrors of the Second World War was to create social structures that would create a new world for the people who would survive that war. I think we should remember that. Finland, when its banking system collapsed, used that crisis to actually turn around its education system, and in particular to build a preschool system that now in many ways is envied around the world. The social protection budget, large as it is, actually represents just one component of income support. The advantage lies in its transparency. The cost of child benefit or old age pensions, as Blair showed there, is clearly itemised and is explicitly listed for examination and comment. Not so the wide variety of hidden subsidies to housing and pensions, not to mention construction, that come from so-called tax expenditures, where the public support and subsidy is much less transparent. It is one thing to list the direct cost of state pensions for senior citizens in the social protection estimates, but it's just as important to reveal and scrutinise the cost of tax shelters for pension provision and the huge disparity in the value of those subsidies between the very well-off and those on low and modest incomes. Let me say one thing without ambiguity. If any direct welfare item is on the table for a cut, then so must these discrete hidden items that so distort our tax system. And they haven't gone away, just because of the banking crisis. We sometimes, like to think that, but they haven't. There is a zero appetite for looking at entitlement programmes unless there is an equivalent commitment to substantial reform of tax-based shelters as well. One other sign I would like to see is this. In October, the so-called tax exiles will have to make their first payments of the new levy introduced by the late Brian Lenihan as a way to insist on some degree of transparent contribution from this very wealthy group. I will be watching very closely the total amount this Lenihan levy will yield. There cannot be one set of rules that demands sacrifices from pensioners and children in disadvantaged families, while a seriously wealthy elite procrastinate again as to their responsibility to take their fair share of the national burden. The original Freedom of Information Act had many successes in its initial 5 years, but was emasculated as soon as Bertie Ahern's second government took office. I was amazed at the subdued reaction to this among journalists. Again, the deep-seated values of an old political culture, both among political leaders and public servants, led to the destruction of a valued law. The one single feature of that culture that has caused the most damage is the sense of impunity it has created and sustained for decades. This is when people think that they can get away with doing what is wrong without serious penalty. It bewilders the ordinary citizen to witness the scandals and to see no one punished. The wrongdoers get away with it and are confident that they can delay and frustrate inquiries to the point of exhaustion. Another reform I want to see enacted in the 31st Dáil is an overhaul of company law and a ruthless determination to punish white-collar crime and malpractice. Our standards of corporate governance are woeful. The same tiny golden circle dominates the boards of Irish companies, a self-perpetuating oligarchy drawn from an extremely narrow group of well-connected individuals. Obviously, the law as it stands must take its course without political interference, but I do wonder how adequate and effective company law is and how vulnerable it is to evasion and manipulation. After the dirt scandals, it did seem that a new culture of compliance had taken hold. Alas, I think that turned out to be an illusion. We cannot lecture people who depend on the support of benefits about responsibility if we do not also address the problem at the top, in both the public and in the private sectors. But I am optimistic that this government has begun the process of transformation. I'm heartened not just by the achievements within my own department, but also by the achievements of Cabinet colleagues who have finally secured interest rate reductions on the bailout loans, launched the Jobs Initiative and issued a very strong response to the Cloyne report that did this Republic proud. We are, of course, all constrained in what we can achieve by the fact that we are living on borrowed money. I wish I could promise that restoring our economic sovereignty would be quick. I wish I could promise that restoring our economic sovereignty would be painless. But this much I can promise you. I will never forget that the vast majority of people who turned to my department for protection, they played no role in causing this financial crisis. And I will also do my best to ensure the burden of resolving that crisis does not fall disproportionately on their shoulders. During my term as Minister for Social Protection, we will transform our system of social protection so that it becomes financially sustainable and responsive to the needs of recipients. We will ensure that benefits are targeted to those who are most in need and to those who have contributed to the system. We will move from a passive model of income support to a proactive work-first system that enables people to get back to employment, training or education as soon as possible. And we will ensure that it is always more attractive to work than to remain in receipt of benefits. Thank you very much.